It was the year of our Lord, a time marked by monumental struggles and epoch-defining battles. The Armenian highlands, a rugged and storied land, bore witness to a day that would forever be etched into the annals of history. On this Friday, the 26th of August, the sun, ablaze and blisteringly hot, was slowly retreating towards the horizon, its golden rays casting a fiery hue across the vast plain that stretched out before the fortress of Manzikert. The entire steppe appeared as if it was set aflame, painted in ominous crimson tones that seemed almost to foretell a come dramatic and bloody confrontation. The air was thick with dust, stirred up by the relentless hoofbeats of countless horses and the marching of tens of thousands of soldiers. This swirling cloud of powder was infused with a pungent mixture of wild wormwood, sweat-soaked horsehides, and the metallic scent of weapons and blood, an olfactory testament to the impending clash. Perched atop a commanding hill, surrounded by his loyal guard clad in shimmering armour, sat Emperor Roman Vervgen, a formidable figure on his proud warhorse. Throughout the day, his army, an unyielding and formidable force of the Byzantine Empire's finest, pressed relentlessly against the encroaching enemy hordes. The entire operation was unfolding exactly as planned. The Seljuk Turks, wild nomads from the steppes, found themselves unable to withstand the relentless pressure of the formidable Byzantine foot soldiers and the disciplined Frankish mercenaries. They repeatedly fell back under the heavy onslaught, their ranks disintegrating into chaos as they attempted Lumo tactics, retreat, regroup, and feint to evade the heavy blows. Yet time and again, the invincible phalanx of Byzantine shields, the Tegma, pushed them back, repelling wave after wave of assaults with unyielding strength. In Roman's mind, the vision of victory was clear. Today, he was destined to crush his rival, the ambitious Sultan Alp Arslan. He would break the barbarian hunger to plunder the eastern borders of the empire for generations to come. The capital, Constantinople, would witness his triumph, and his name would be inscribed alongside the legendary Vasilius Bulgaro Bitsa, a figure whose glory was to eclipse even the greatest of his predecessors. Yet, as the daylight waned and shadows lengthened across the battlefield, a gnawing doubt began to take root in Roman's heart. The enemy, wily and insidious, was more elusive than ever, and his own army, a diverse, sprawling mosaic of troops, was becoming unwieldy and overextended. As the final rays of the setting sun dipped below the horizon, Roman issued a command to his forces, a strategic retreat to the fortified camp, to gather strength for a decisive counterattack at dawn. He raised his personal standard, signalling to his troops that the battle was momentarily paused, but not lost. However, what happened next defied all expectations. Far behind the front lines, in the area where his reserve forces had been stationed, commanded by his political rival, Caesar Andronicus Ducas, strange movements began to emerge. Instead of covering the retreat, these reserve units suddenly turned around and began to withdraw from the battlefield altogether. A sinister whisper spread among the troops, carrying the terrifying rumour that their emperor had fallen. The message, fueled by panic and treachery, called for immediate escape. Just at that moment, as if triggered by some hidden signal, the Turkish forces, who for hours had been feigning retreat, suddenly erupted into a ferocious charge, their horns howling with a demonic fury. The earth trembled as thousands of horses stomped in unison, unleashing a deafening noise that resonated across the dying landscape. From the hills and the flanks, even from beneath the very ground, the defeated Byzantine army, bereft of discipline and unity, was overwhelmed by a relentless storm of steel and chaos. Descending from the high ground, the crescent-shaped Seljuk cavalry launched their iron assault with a brutal, unstoppable surge. Roman IV, the emperor, was swiftly becoming aware that the battle, already lost in his eyes, was in fact slipping beyond any hope of redemption. The realization that this was no ordinary defeat, but a catastrophe of catastrophic proportions, was just beginning to dawn on him. That evening, amidst the dust and upheaval at the forgotten fortress walls, situated in a remote Armenian region, the fate of not only Roman's empire but the entire civilization itself hung in balance. What was unfolding was not merely a military loss, but the prelude to a historical epoch involving the confrontation of worlds and cultures. That night, the blood and chaos would set the stage for what later generations would remember as the outset of the Crusades, a monumental clash that would reshape the course of history for centuries to come. To grasp the true depth of the abyss into which Byzantium plummeted during the Battle of Manzikert, one must first imagine the empire at the height of its power, a moment when its greatness appeared untouchable and its glory glittered brighter than in any other era since the reign of the legendary Justinian the Great. Only by ascending to that exalted vantage point can one truly understand the enormity of the impending downfall, the irrevocable turning point that would lead to centuries of decline, chaos, and transformation. Let's travel back in time 5 centuries, to the year 1025, a year forever marked by the death of one of the most formidable Byzantine emperors, Basileios the Bulgaro-Boitsa. His nearly 50-year reign became a golden epoch, a peak of Byzantine military strength and political influence, shaping the empire's history for generations to come. Basileios was a man forged of steel, stern and ascetic, devoid of interest in romantic attachments or opulent courtly pleasures. Throughout his life, he dedicated himself entirely to one unwavering goal: the restoration and consolidation of the Imperium. Serving as a soldier turned emperor, he spent the bulk of his years not within the luxurious halls of Constantinople, but engaged in relentless military campaigns across various frontiers. His efforts bore fruit in monumental proportions. By the year 1025, the Byzantine Empire, or Romania as the inhabitants called it, had reached its greatest territorial extent since the days of Arab conquests. To the north, after nearly 3 decades of fierce and exhausting warfare, Basileios shattered the First Bulgarian Empire. Following the decisive Battle of Clydium in the year 1114, he ordered an atrocity, blinding 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners of war, leaving 1 man in 100 with 1 eye to serve as a guide, and then marched this horrifying procession straight to their ruler, Tsar Samuel. Upon witnessing his blinded army, the Bulgarian king was struck down with a fatal heart attack. By the year 1814, Bulgaria was fully subdued, turned into a Byzantine province. The empire's northern border on the Balkan Peninsula was firmly established along the Danube, reminiscent of Tiberius's frontier in ancient times. To the east, Basileios waged successful campaigns against the Arab Emirates, pushing the imperial frontiers further into Syria and the Caucasus, securing dominance over Armenia and Georgia. His generals reclaimed the southern Italian lands from Arab control, expanding Byzantium's influence across the Mediterranean. The imperial treasury overflowed with gold, storing in its vaults around 200,000 centenaries, a staggering sum equivalent to roughly 10 million gold numismata, enough to sustain a formidable army and navy for an entire decade. The military machine perfected and operated by Basileios was regarded as the most advanced of its era. Its foundations rested upon 2 key pillars: first was the theme system. The entire imperial territory was divided into military administrative provinces called themes. Within each theme, peasant stratiotes received land grants in exchange for their obligation to serve as soldiers, facilitating the quick mobilization of a loyal, well-acquainted local militia. The second and more formidable element was composed of the tagmata, elite regiments of the permanent professional army stationed within and around Constantinople. These soldiers were heavily armoured cavalry, clad from head to hoof in plated steel, resembling their war horses in their protective gear. The sight of these ironclad horsemen advancing in tight formation towards the enemy was enough to invoke terror across the battlefield. At the pinnacle of this military machinery stood the Emperor's personal guard, the legendary Varangian Guard, composed predominantly of Scandinavian Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. These fierce warriors, wielding axes and determined to serve their monarch, were unwaveringly loyal to the Emperor himself. Their reputation for resilience and ferocity was legendary. They fought with unmatched brutality and tenacity. Constantinople, the Queen of Cities, was the heart of the known world, situated at the crossroads of crucial trade routes connecting Europe and Asia. From the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, it commanded control over the vast flow of commerce and ideas between continents. This strategic position enabled Constantinople not only to thrive economically, but also to influence global affairs profoundly, cementing its status as the world's most powerful metropolis. Along the great trade routes connecting distant lands, a vibrant exchange of goods and cultures unfolded. From the distant Russian lands, caravans carried furs, honey, beeswax, and even slaves heading towards Greek territories. These goods traversed the long and winding routes, sometimes known as the Zergosha Kushkumku, linking the Rus to the Byzantines. Similarly, along the famed Silk Road, commodities from China and Central Asia arrived: luxurious silks, aromatic spices, and rare precious objects that adorned the courtly chambers of kings and merchants alike. Western Europe, particularly through Italian merchants from Amalfi and Venice, sent its own treasures eastward, completing this web of commerce that spanned continents. Throughout these bustling trade corridors, the Imperial Customs Office levied a 10% tax on all imported and exported goods passing through the city's gates, fueling the treasury with enormous revenues. In this thriving economic landscape, the Byzantine gold coin, either the mesmer or the salit, became a symbol of stability and trustworthiness, functioning much like the modern dollar in its time, maintaining its value across nations and seas. Meanwhile, the cultural and scholarly life flourished, entering what historians now call the Macedonian Renaissance. While Western Europe lingered in the shadows of the early Middle Ages, Constantinople shone as a beacon of enlightenment. Monastic scholars painstakingly copied and preserved the treasured texts of ancient philosophers, historians, and mathematicians such as Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and Thucydid. Thanks to their efforts, these invaluable intellectual riches survived to nourish future generations. In the grand cathedrals like Hagia Sophia, intricate mosaics and artworks were created that dazzled and inspired all who saw them. The city, having recovered from the tumultuous iconoclasm disturbances, stood as the spiritual heart of the Orthodox Christian world. It served as a cultural and religious nexus stretching from the Balkan Peninsula to the vast expanses of Rus. The baptism of Rus under Prince Vladimir was not merely a spiritual event, but also a masterstroke of Byzantine diplomacy, one of the greatest geopolitical successes in the empire's extensive history. By the mid-10th century, Byzantium had become a colossal power, a superstate of its age. It boasted a formidable army, a prospering economy, a rich cultural scene, and centuries-old diplomatic mastery. The emperor was regarded as God's earthly representative, and his empire was seen as the terrestrial reflection of the heavenly kingdom. It appeared that nothing and no one could threaten this gleaming city on the Bosphorus, this jewel of civilization. Yet, beyond the distant eastern horizons, in the limitless steppes of Central Asia, a different turbulence was awakening. The dust was stirring under the hooves of an unknown people's horses, people destined to challenge the mighty Byzantine colossus and deliver a blow from which it might never fully recover. As Byzantium revelled in its golden age, amid the swirling chaos of diverse peoples and cultures, tectonic shifts were quietly occurring far away. In the northern steppes, beyond the shores of the Aral Sea in what is now Kazakhstan, a confederation of Turkic tribes known as the Aguts was roaming. These were hardy, resilient nomads, forged by unending wandering and constant pursuit of survival. Masterful horsemen and expert archers, they lived by the harsh laws of the steppe, seeking fresh pastures, defending their own honour and standing, and waging wars with neighbouring tribes. Their religion was Tengriism, a worship of the eternal blue sky, a spiritual reflection of their environment's vastness. However, these nomads were already beginning to encounter larger influences from afar. Along the routes of the Silk Road, they came into contact with other faiths, Nestorian Christianity, Buddhism, and Judaism, religions that gradually penetrated their world, expanding their spiritual horizons. By the end of the 10th century, a dramatic event unfolded that would shape the very destiny of these peoples. One of the clans within the confederation, led by a chieftain named Seljuk, found itself embroiled in conflicts with the high-ranking Oghuz tribes, their rivals within the same tribal union. Discontent and internal struggles pushed Seljuk and his followers southward, beyond the reaches of their homeland, into the region of Nizovye Sir Daria, on the border between the Turkic steppe and the Islamic world. Here, in the lands of Mavarana, meaning land beyond the river, referring to the region lying between the Amu Darya and Sir Daria rivers, a pivotal event took place. In this crucial confrontation of history, Seljuk's family and followers embraced Islam of the Sunni denomination. This decision would have profound consequences, setting the stage for new alliances, conflicts, and cultural transformations that would ripple through history, altering the political landscape of Central Asia and beyond. The event was far more than a simple change of faith. It marked the beginning of entry into a vast, entirely new civilizational realm. By embracing Islam, the former pagan nomads, who had once followed traditional polytheistic beliefs, gained access to a sophisticated Arabic-Persian culture that was rich in literary tradition and complex societal structures, including a well-developed legal system. Yet, most importantly, they acquired a powerful ideological foundation that would ignite and justify their martial spirit. They transformed into Ghazis, warriors fighting in the name of their faith, fighters engaged in what was now recognized as a sacred struggle, or jihad, rather than mere plunderers marauding on the borders of their neighbours. The grandchildren of the Seljuk Turks, brothers Togrulbek and Chagri Beg, proved to be exceptional military strategists and political leaders. They united and led a vigorous, passionate force called the Union of Tribes, which was named after their grandfather, the legendary Seljuk. The year of 1240 saw their pivotal moment. At the Battle of Dandankan, they decisively routed the armies of the mighty Ghaznavid Sultanate, a formidable state that had held sway over parts of Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan. This victory was a clear turning point, a point of no return. because it opened the way westward toward Iran and Mesopotamia. The Seljuk invasion was akin to an unstoppable avalanche, sweeping across the steppes and swiftly gaining ground. Their army was primarily composed of highly mobile light cavalry. Each soldier was equipped with several energetic steppe horses, granting them exceptional speed and agility on the battlefield. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, a marvel of ancient engineering that could fire accurate, deadly arrows over great distances. This weapon, combined with their tactical ingenuity, had been perfected over centuries of steppes warfare. The Seljuk horsemen preferred to avoid direct confrontations with heavy infantry, instead skillfully maneuvering around their enemies, showering them with volleys of arrows, a tactic often called swarm warfare, designed to exhaust and provoke overextending foes into hasty, unfavourable assault. One of their favourite and most effective manoeuvres was the feigned retreat. They would appear to break ranks and flee, luring the enemy into a false sense of victory. Once the enemy's formation was disorganised and their attention lured, the Seljuk cavalry would suddenly turn back and strike with ferocity, targeting the apprehensive and disoriented vanguard or the flanks of the opposing army. Such cunning tactics allowed them to dismantle larger or better equipped forces and gain the upper hand. By the year 1155, Togrulbek's military success had advanced to a new stage. He entered Baghdad triumphantly, the historic city that was then the political and cultural heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. By this period, the Abbasid Caliphate, descendants of Prophet Muhammad, had long since lost their true political authority, serving mainly as spiritual leaders for the Sunni Muslim world. The actual governance of Baghdad was exercised by Shiite emirates from the Buyid dynasty, who held real power. Despite this, Togrulbek proclaimed himself the defender of the Caliph and the Sunni faith, aligning himself with the spiritual authority of the Caliphate in a show of political legitimacy. In recognition of his loyalty, the Caliph conferred upon him the title of Sultan, meaning custodian or mightiest ruler, thus elevating his status from a tribal chieftain to a sovereign ruler. This event marked the birth of the Great Seljuk Empire, an expansive realm stretching from Central Asia all the way to the borders of Egypt. However, within this vast empire, a significant challenge quickly emerged. The Seljuk sultans, now ruling over a large sedentary territory, committed to establishing a centralized administration rooted in Iranian bureaucratic traditions, faced resistance from their core tribal constituents. Many of the Turkmen or Oghuz tribes, the very tribes that had brought them to power, remained attached to their nomadic, free-spirited way of life. These tribes were primarily warriors, not farmers or bureaucrats, and they looked down upon a sedentary existence and the authority of government officials. Their interests lay in new pastures for their herds, and the opportunity for military plunder rather than taxes or civil administration. Controlling these fiercely independent nomadic tribes proved to be a complex problem for the wise Seljuk sultans. To address this, they devised an ingenious solution. Rather than trying to suppress or assimilate these unruly tribes, they redirected their energy outward toward common enemies of Islam. The primary adversary on their western frontier was the Byzantine Empire, a venerable and formidable power holding territories in Anatolia and Armenia. The eastern provinces of Byzantium, with their prosperous cities and fertile pastures, represented an ideal target for Seljuk raids conducted under the guise of Ghazi warfare. These nomadic tribes, motivated by their warrior ethos and quest for plunder, saw these expeditions as a sacred duty, further fueling the expansion of their campaigns into Byzantine lands. During this turbulent period, roughly in the middle of the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire faced a formidable new threat for the very first time. The initial invasions carried out by Turkmen, detachments into Armenia and eastern Anatolia resembled a series of wolf bites, swift, brutal, and unpredictable. These raiders would pillage villages, steal livestock, abduct residents to enslave, and then abruptly vanish back into the steppes long before the Byzantine military units could muster an effective response. Initially, the Byzantines were unaware of the true nature of this menace. They were accustomed to combat with regular armies of the Arab Emirates, which openly fought in pitched battles or besieged fortresses with disciplined armies. However, these flying Turks, as they were called, seemed to appear as elusive shadows or ghostly figures, spreading fear but evading capture. Over the years, their raids grew larger and more destructive, pushing into broader territories and leaving devastation in their wake. By the year 4048, the combined Byzantine-Georgian army suffered a significant defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks, marking a turning point in their incursions. Then, in 1664, a new ruler, the Sultan's nephew, and a resourceful, vigorous leader known as Alp Arslan, meaning brave lion, stormed the ancient and once prosperous Armenian capital of Ani. The assault was brutal and ruthless. The city was subjected to a massacre of such horror that chroniclers recount it was choked by heaps of corpses, rendering any movement through the streets impossible. The fall of Ani shocked the entire Christian world, revealing that a deadly new enemy had emerged in the east. This threat was now knocking at the gates of Anatolia, the very heart and breadbasket of the Byzantine Empire. Though the empire appeared mighty, inherited from the era of Basil the Bulgar Slayer, and possessed considerable resources, armies, and martial experience in the east, by this time much of its former strength had waned. The second half of the 10th century in Byzantium was a period marked by profound internal crises, weaknesses, political intrigue, and self-destructive policies that ultimately laid the groundwork for the catastrophe of Manzikert. After the death of Emperor Basil, the Bulgar Slayer, in the year 2025, his brother Constantine VII ascended the throne. He was an aging, pampered hedonist who had spent his life in the shadow of his illustrious sibling, caring chiefly for banquets, horse racing, and dice games. His brief reign signalled the beginning of decline. With no male heirs, on his deathbed, Constantine chose to marry off his daughter, the 50-year-old Zoe, to the Constantinopolitan Epiarch, the city's mayor, Roman Argir, and declared him his successor. This marked the beginning of the era of the so-called Men of Zoe and weak emperors, puppets enthroned by the powerful Byzantine bureaucracy in the imperial capital. Within Byzantine society of the 10th century, tensions intensified between two main aristocratic factions. On one side was the military aristocracy, noble landowners from the provinces, especially Anatolia, whose clans, such as the Du, the Comentes, the Diogenes, and the Fox, formed the backbone of the officer corps. Their influence and wealth were rooted in land ownership and martial service, and they favoured an aggressive foreign policy along with a robust and capable army. Conversely, standing in opposition to this military elite was the civil aristocracy rooted in Constantinople, the urban aristocracy and bureaucratic class. These two factions represented deeply entrenched interests, and their rivalry and conflicting priorities further destabilized an empire already on the verge of losing its strength to external enemies. During this period, the Byzantine Empire was governed by highly educated and influential bureaucrats, legal experts, and financiers who held sway over the vast imperial machinery, the Senate, and various palace offices. Their leader and chief ideologue was none other than Michael Psellos, one of the greatest intellectual figures in Byzantine history, a philosopher, historian, and court intriguer. These political factions harboured deep fears about strengthening the military, perceiving the army as a threat to their own hegemony. Instead of supporting warfare, they championed diplomacy as the primary tool of statecraft. They believed that the empire's true enemies were not external foes, but rather those within, the military aristocracy that wielded power on the frontiers. Throughout the middle of the 10th century, these civilian-minded elites consistently held sway over imperial authority. Emperors such as Michael V Pothos, Michael V Palaiologos, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos, and the renowned Zoe, each in turn, pursued policies aimed at weakening the military forces. They viewed the army solely as a potential source of rebellion and a costly burden that drained state resources. These rulers dismantled the old military administrative system known as the femata. Land holdings that once belonged to stratiotics, soldier peasants responsible for local defence, began to be confiscated, stripping these farmers of their traditional rights. Military service that once required land grants was replaced by monetary taxes, fundamentally undermining the empire's mobilization foundation. Consequently, there was a large-scale reduction in the standing army. Entire regiments were disbanded to save money, leaving the empire increasingly vulnerable. The renowned Byzantine historian and contemporary observer John Skylitzes bitterly recorded how Emperor Constantine IX disbanded a 30,000-strong corps stationed at the border with Armenia, transforming brave soldiers into mere tax collectors. The imperial strategy shifted decisively toward reliance on mercenaries. Instead of maintaining dependable native troops, the emperors preferred to pay hefty sums to hire foreign soldiers from across Europe and beyond, such as Franks and Normans from the west, Varangians from Scandinavia and Rus, and most perilously, nomads from the steppes, including Cumans and Avars, who were kin to the Seljuk Turks. While these mercenaries were brave, their loyalty was fleeting. They fought primarily for money and readily switched allegiances if offered better pay by the enemy. During peacetime, they often turned to plundering the local population, making them a disastrous substitute for a reliable army. The result was a disorganized, multilingual band of fighters, poorly commanded and difficult to control. This shift in military policy had catastrophic consequences. The eastern frontier became dangerously exposed. As Turkmen raids increased along the border, the empire lacked enough troops to resist. The local communities, deprived of adequate defence, suffered heavily and grew restless. Simultaneously, the empire's economy was in decline. To cover the vast expenditures on court luxury and pay mercenaries, the emperors resorted to debasing the coinage. They reduced the gold content in the numisma, mixing it with copper, which led to a significant devaluation of the currency, once considered one of the most stable coins in the world. The Byzantine monetary system began to collapse into inflation, undermining trade and economic stability. Adding to these crises, in the year 1554, the Byzantine world faced a spiritual and political upheaval that would have lasting consequences. Tensions between Rome and Constantinople, simmering for centuries, finally erupted into their climax. The papal legate, Cardinal Humbert, and the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, mutually excommunicated each other, effectively severing communion. This event marked the Great Schism, the irreversible split of Christianity into two distinct branches, the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Byzantine Christendom found itself isolated spiritually from Western Europe, a division that would shape the future course of history, with often tragic effects. In the year 1068, a turbulent period when the empire was teetering on the brink of collapse, and Turkish raiders pillaged the heartland of Anatolia. An audacious palace coup took place that would forever alter its course. At the centre of this upheaval was Empress Dowager Eudocia Makrem-Voleta, a wise and resolute woman who understood that her crumbling empire desperately needed a strong and capable military leader to restore stability. Recognizing this, she entered into a marriage alliance with one of the most prominent figures of the military aristocracy, an exceptionally talented and highly respected commander among the troops. This man's name was Roman Diagon, and in many ways he represented the final hope of the imperial realm. While the empire languished and gradually sank into crisis, on its eastern borders, in the midst of relentless warfare, the destiny of a man was being forged, one destined to become the last hero of an era waning. Roman Diagon was a true product of the Anatolian military aristocracy, a lineage that had long been both feared and despised in the imperial capital. He hailed from a noble Cappadocian family that had produced several brilliant generals throughout history, each leaving a significant mark on the empire's military achievements. From a young age, Roman dedicated himself to the martial profession, swiftly ascending the ranks with remarkable speed, progressing from a humble officer to the strategos of the theme, a regional military governor responsible for defending vital territories. He was a man of his time, a product of his social environment, brave to the point of recklessness, energetic in pursuit of his goals, and driven by fierce ambition. Roman epitomized the qualities of an ideal field commander, tall, imposing in stature, endowed with immense physical strength, and personally leading his soldiers into the fray. His leadership in battle inspired admiration and unwavering loyalty among his troops, fostering a sense of unity and resolve that often turned the tide of combats. However, his straightforward manner and allegiance to the military faction made him a suspicious figure in the eyes of the imperial administrators and bureaucrats sitting in the imperial court. In the year 1067, following the death of Emperor Constantine I Ducas, Roman found himself accused of conspiracy, allegedly plotting to seize the throne. He was swiftly arrested and transported to Constantinople for trial, facing the very threat of execution. Yet, fate had other plans. The widowed Empress, Eudocia, who ruled as regent for her young sons, offspring of Constantine I, perceived the dire state of the empire firsthand. Turkish bands had already pressed into the depths of Asia Minor, reaching the very gates of Caesarea. The Empress understood that what was desperately needed was not a mere bureaucrat or philosopher, but a true emperor warrior capable of facing the chaos. Her choice fell upon the man she believed could lead the empire out of its peril, an accused rebel and convicted traitor, Roman Diagon. In a dramatic turn of events, instead of the expected punishment, Roman was granted clemency. On the 1st of January 1068, he was pardoned, released from imprisonment, and, through a strategic political marriage, became the consort of Empress Eudocia. Shortly thereafter, he was crowned as co-emperor alongside her young sons, an action that shocked many, especially the powerful Ducas clan, who viewed this union as a political maneuver, a marriage of convenience designed to strengthen her position. This alliance, however, was deeply resented by the Ducas family. Their patriarch, Emperor John Ducas, the brother of the late Constantine I, reluctantly agreed to the marriage, but harboured a bitter resentment that festered beneath the surface. Along with his sons, particularly the clever and treacherous Nikitas Ducas, they regarded Roman as a brash outsider, an upstart and usurper who had stolen the throne from their rightful heir, Michael VI Ducas. From the very first day of Roman's reign, they began weaving a web of conspiracy, waiting for an opportune moment to strike and remove him from power. Nevertheless, Roman Diogen was a man of action, not intrigue. Barely had he taken control when he left behind the luxurious confines of Constantinople to head east with his army. What he saw upon reaching the frontiers shattered his illusions and filled him with horror. The once formidable army of Basil II Basileus had all but vanished, the fighting spirit and discipline long eroded. The provincial militias had been disbanded, and the fortresses left unguarded in a state of neglect. The core of the forces now consisted primarily of mercenaries, hired fighters demanding exorbitant pay, who showed scant enthusiasm or restraint in battle, their loyalty bought by coin rather than conviction. This grim reality presented a stark contrast to the glorious martial traditions of the empire, a sign of the mounting internal decay and the peril threatening its borders. A figure of monumental energy and determination embarked on the formidable task of restoring his army, pouring vast resources into its reconstruction. He meticulously organized training exercises, re-establishing discipline and order among the troops, and personally inspected the military forces to ensure their readiness. Over the course of 3 years leading up to the year 1071, he launched several military campaigns into Syria and Armenia. Although these expeditions did not yield decisive victory, they were nonetheless marked by significant successes. He managed to push back the Turkish forces, reclaiming several critical fortresses, including the strategically important city of Edessa. These achievements demonstrated that the Byzantine Empire was still capable of active resistance and engaging in military action. Such victories greatly bolstered his reputation among his soldiers and followers, reinforcing his authority. Yet, at the same time, they ignited even greater hostility among his enemies in Constantinople, who whispered conspiratorially that the emperor was frivolously spending the treasury on pointless wars, and that his true motive was personal glory rather than the good of the empire. By the dawn of the year 1071, Emperor Roman III Diogenes reached a momentous decision, one that would become the culmination of his career and his most daring gamble. He resolved to put an end to the Turkish threat once and for all, aiming for a decisive victory that would secure the empire's future. His plan was ambitious and sweeping. He intended to assemble the largest army the empire had seen in the past 50 years, enough to strike a crippling blow into Turkish-held territories. His strategy was to invade Armenia, capture vital fortress cities such as Manzikert and Seljuk, and force Sultan Alp Arslan into an open battle, a confrontation he believed would end in inevitable victory. Confidence in his plans was unshakable. He trusted utterly in the strength of his newly rebuilt army, in his own military genius, and in the righteousness of his cause. Fully convinced of impending success, he failed to realize that he was leading his forces into a trap, one woven from internal treachery and betrayal. Unknown to him, his greatest adversary did not reside among the Turks, but secretly lurked within his own camp, among those who smiled to his face and swore loyalty, yet plotted against him in the shadows. What was meant to be his glorious campaign, the triumph that would immortalize his name, was transforming into a perilous gamble, an existential game where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the empire itself. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the south, the person whom this entire military effort was aimed against was entirely preoccupied with other matters. The second great Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, meaning brave lion in Turkic, paid little heed to the prospects of war with Byzantium. His primary focus and sacred mission was the destruction of the chief ideological and political adversary of Sunni Islam. the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. For Alp Arslan, as for his uncle Tughril Beg, uniting the entire Muslim world under the banner of Sunni orthodoxy and consolidating Seljuk rule over the region was his paramount goal. Byzantium, undoubtedly an enemy of the faith with its heretic ways, was considered a secondary threat at best. Turkic nomadic raids into Byzantine borders, from Alp Arslan's perspective, were more useful as a means to channel the restless energy of his unruly subjects and to weaken his neighbouring states, rather than as a prelude to full-scale conquest. Alp Arslan was a worthy successor to his uncle, brave and brilliant in battle, but also wise in statecraft. In warfare, he was a lion, fierce and relentless, yet in governance, his partner was the wise vizier Nizam al-Mulk, a master statesman whose intelligence and administrative talents were the backbone of Seljuk power. Nizam al-Mulk, the eminent vizier and author of the renowned treatise on governance called Siyasatnama, sometimes translated as the Book of Government, served as the guiding hand behind the empire's effective administration. His work laid the foundational principles of statecraft, establishing systems of justice, infrastructure, and education. He was instrumental in building madrasas, educational institutions that fostered learning and scholarship, which became vital centres of culture and knowledge across the empire. Nizam al-Mulk's patronage extended to the sciences and arts, and he sought to reconcile the diverse interests of nomadic Turkic aristocrats and the settled populations of Persian, Arab, and other ethnicities within the empire's expansive borders. His efforts to unify the realm through wise administration and cultural patronage played a crucial role in the ongoing consolidation of Seljuk authority, making him not only a political architect, but also an intellectual force shaping the golden age of his era. Alp Arslan was truly a man of his people. He lived a life of simplicity, remaining accessible and humble in his everyday dealings. He shared the hardships of his soldiers and fought alongside them in their campaigns, embodying the qualities of a leader who genuinely cared for his men. Islamic chroniclers describe him as a pious and just ruler, yet also note his quick temper and formidable presence when angered. He was an exceptional archer, renowned for his skill, and he personally led his troops into battle with unwavering courage. In the year 170, he successfully quelled rebellions across his vast empire, stabilizing his rule and consolidating power. Following this, he began preparations for what would be the greatest campaign of his life, a bold expedition into Egypt. At the beginning of the year 1071, Alp Arslan's army laid siege to the pivotal fortress cities in Syria. His forces captured key Byzantine and Fatimid strongholds, including the city of Aleppo, strengthening his foothold in the region. With his armies advancing southward, he was on the verge of crossing into Egypt, poised to extend his influence into the heart of the Muslim world's southern territories. However, just as victory seemed imminent, alarming news arrived from the northern frontiers. A massive army led by the reigning emperor, Roman III Diogenes, had invaded Armenia and laid siege to the city of Manzikert. This unexpected report threw Alp Arslan into a perilous dilemma. His best and most disciplined forces were stationed far to the south in Syria, exhausted after recent campaigns, while his opponents from Byzantium numbered in the tens of thousands, vastly outnumbering his own troops. Faced with these dire circumstances, any other general might have chosen to retreat, to avoid battle altogether, or to pull back to regroup, possibly losing some fortresses, but preserving his army for future campaigns. Yet, Alp Arslan was not one to surrender or seek safety in retreat. He understood that showing weakness at this moment could shatter his authority and undermine his standing among the Muslim tribes and rulers. Recognizing the importance of striking boldly, he made a daring and nearly reckless decision. Leaving most of his forces in Syria, he gathered a highly elite detachment of his cavalry, comprising roughly between 15 and 20,000 warriors. With remarkable speed and determination, this force launched a rapid, relentless march toward the north across more than 500 kilometers of hostile territory. Along the way, Alp Arslan's men gathered additional recruits, nomadic Turkmen, tribesmen, and Kurdish volunteers, augmenting their numbers as they pushed forward. Though his army was smaller, it was a unified, highly mobile force familiar with the terrain and capable of striking swiftly against the enemy. Upon reaching the vicinity of Lake Van, Alp Arslan sought to avoid confrontation and attempted negotiations. He dispatched envoys to Emperor Roman, offering terms of peace. His primary objective remained Egypt, and he hoped to avoid the bloodshed of battle by proposing a peaceful resolution, a recognition of the status quo in exchange for peace. However, the Byzantine ruler, confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority, dismissed these overtures with contempt. He interpreted Alp Arslan's offer as a sign of weakness and fear. According to the Byzantine chronicler Michael Ataliatis, Roman's arrogant response was that peace would only be possible in the city of Rey, the then capital of the Seljuk Sultanate, and that he was confident of defeating the Sultan and dictating the terms of surrender from a position of strength. Rejecting peace, Emperor Roman Vance Diogenes made battle inevitable. Alp Arslan, donning a white shroud as a symbol of readiness to face death in the name of faith, addressed his army in a fiery speech. He declared that he would fight as a simple soldier, and whoever wished to follow him was welcome. Those who preferred to flee could do so. He proclaimed that on this day there was no sultan nor slaves, only warriors. Those who fell in the fight would become martyrs, earning their place in paradise. Those who survived would gain glory and abundant spoils. His soldiers responded with a unified roar of resolve, rallying to their leader's call. The Sultan prepared himself for the most critical battle of his life, knowing that the outcome could determine the fate of his empire and his legacy. In the spring of that year, a vast army assembled from Constantinople, unprecedented in size within the empire for many decades. Emperor Roman I Diogenes mobilized all available forces, gathered under his banners, eager to confront the advancing Muslim army and assert his dominance. The stage was set for a clash that would be remembered throughout history, a confrontation of enormous scale and significance, which would forever change the course of the region's history. Various sources cite different figures for the size of the Byzantine army, ranging from 100,000 to 400,000 soldiers, but all these numbers are undoubtedly exaggerated. Contemporary historians generally estimate that the Byzantine military forces at the time of the confrontation numbered approximately 40 to 70,000 men. Even this substantial force, however, was formidable for the period in question. The real issue, though, lay not in the sheer number of troops, but rather in their composition and the quality of their training and organization. This army was far from being a unified, tightly knit fighting force under Vasilius Bulgarbates. Instead, it represented a diverse mosaic of different peoples and contingents, true an army of nations. Its core consisted of remnants of the Tag Mata, professional heavy cavalry units that still retained a significant level of martial prowess, although they had gradually diminished in number over time. Alongside them, there were various detachments drawn from the European and Asian provinces of the empire, known as the Themes, each bringing their own forces into the fold. Yet, what made up perhaps the largest portion, potentially up to 50% of the entire army, were mercenaries, hired fighters who fought not out of loyalty but for monetary gain. These mercenaries included heavily armoured knights from Western Europe, particularly Franks and Normans, led by the renowned and ambitious adventurer Russell de Bale. These soldiers were exceptional warriors, highly skilled and experienced, but they harboured no allegiance to Byzantium itself. Their sole motivation was monetary compensation, and they often looked down upon their Byzantine counterparts with disdain. Along with these Western European heavy cavalry, there were also large contingents of mounted archers drawn from the steppe tribes, specifically the Pechenegs and perhaps the Aguzis. And herein lay a dangerous threat. The Aguzis were Turks, ethnically and culturally kin to the Seljuk Turks, who were the emperor's upcoming adversaries. Their loyalty was highly questionable, for they might easily choose the side of the Sultan rather than the Byzantines. On the 13th of March in the year 1071, Emperor Roman IV Palaiologos, leading this vast and diverse army, set out from the imperial capital. His march across the entire region of Anatolia was exhausting and arduous, hindered not only by the vast distances, but also by the slow movement of the heavy baggage trains and supplies. During the campaign, discipline issues arose early on. Frankish mercenaries, eager for plunder, started raiding local villages and towns, sowing resentment among the local populations. Roman responded with harsh measures to suppress these uprisings and restore order. His heavy-handed tactics further alienated his mercenaries, especially their commanding officer, Russell de Bale, who grew increasingly discontented with the emperor's methods. In the imperial camp, tensions simmered as intrigues and rivalries brewed beneath the surface. The sons of Emperor John Dux, particularly the Andronikos Dukas, who commanded the reserves, accompanied the emperor during this long march, secretly harbouring hopes for his failure. Their clandestine wish was to see the campaign end in defeat, which would elevate their own position and perhaps lead to a change in leadership. Upon reaching the strategic town of Theodosiopolis in modern-day Erzurum, Roman held a military council to consider their next move. His top generals advised caution. They recommended fortifying their positions and awaiting the arrival of the Sultan, whose forces were gathering for the upcoming confrontation. Yet, Roman, driven by impatience and a desire for glory, resolved to launch an attack. This decision marked his first critical and devastating mistake. He chose to divide his forces, believing he could strike a swift and decisive blow. News reached him that Sultan Alp Arslan was engaged far to the south, in Syria, and Roman reasoned that he could take advantage of the situation to act more boldly. He dispatched a significant portion of his army, approximately 20,000 soldiers, including elite units of Varangians and Frankish knights under the command of his most capable general, Joseph Tarhaniot, to the south, with the objective of capturing the important fortress of Halit on the western shores of Lake Van. Meanwhile, with the remaining forces, around 30 to 40,000 men, Roman marched eastward toward Manzikert, the modern-day Malazgirt. His plan, apparently, was to seize both fortresses, then unite his separate armies and confront the approaching Sultan's forces in a single, decisive battle. However, this plan was fundamentally flawed, built on faulty intelligence and underestimating the enemy's movements. Roman was unaware that Alp Arslan had already begun a rapid northward march. He did not realize the Sultan's forces were much closer than he anticipated. The division of the army proved to be a catastrophic mistake, with disastrous consequences. The fate of Tarhaniot's detachment remains a topic of debate among historians. One account suggests they were overwhelmed and defeated in battle by Alp Arslan's advanced detachments before they could even reach the fortress of Hlit. A more likely and widely accepted version, however, is that the reconnaissance unit of Tarhaniyat discovered the main body of the Sultan's army and, convinced that they could not stand alone against such a formidable foe, chose to withdraw secretly and swiftly, failing to notify the emperor of the peril that had now befallen them. This reckless division and misjudgment set the stage for one of Byzantium's most infamous defeats, marking a tragic turning point in their history. Roman found himself isolated once more, facing a weakened army and unaware that the enemy was already pressing close. On the 23rd of August, in the year of our Lord 1061, he approached Manzikert and, after a brief siege, succeeded in capturing the city. This minor victory, though seemingly insignificant, only boosted his waning confidence, igniting a sense of invincibility within him. Following the conquest, he established his camp in a strategic position near the city and eagerly awaited news from Tarquinius. Meanwhile, on the 24th of August, his scouting detachments engaged unexpectedly with the vanguard of Alp Arslan's forces. The encounter was startling for Roman. It was a shock to realise that the Sultan himself had already arrived on these lands. The clash was fierce and intense, ending in defeat for the Byzantines, with one of their commanders taken captive. In that moment, Roman finally grasped the gravity of his perilous situation. He was now face to face with the entire army of the Sultan, and he had under his command only half of his forces. To retreat at that point would have been both hopeless and dishonourable, so he resolved to fight. The 25th of August was marked by smaller skirmishes and tactical manoeuvres as Roman's forces prepared for the inevitable. Then came the 26th, a Friday, and in the year 1071, Roman III Diogenes made the decisive move. He broke camp and formed his army into a battle-ready formation, anticipating a confrontation that could determine the fate of the empire itself. As the sun rose, the Byzantine army, gleaming under the sunlight with polished armour and standards adorned in gold, began to march into battle with disciplined precision. The sight was truly magnificent, a powerful display designed to showcase the seemingly unbreakable strength of Romans' forces. Their battle formation was a timeless, meticulously crafted arrangement passed down through generations. It consisted of two main lines. The front line was divided into three segments, the left flank commanded by Nicephor Vrenius, the centre held by Emperor Roman himself, and the right flank led by Theodore Aliot. Behind these stood the reserve, positioned strategically in the most critical part of the battlefield, home to the hidden time bomb, or, in military terms, the delaying mine. The reserve was under the command of Andronicus Ducas, the emperor's rival and sworn enemy. His task was to act decisively at the critical moment, support the main forces, enter the fray, and crush the enemy with decisive force. The flanks were largely composed of mercenaries, including nomadic heavy cavalry archers, whose swift mounts and deadly volleys could inflict serious damage. Alp Arslan's army was smaller in numbers, but notably more agile and flexible. Built in the traditional crescent shape favoured by nomadic tribes, it was designed for mobility and deception. The Sultan had no intention of engaging directly with the heavily armoured Byzantine infantry. His strategy relied on attrition, deception, and encirclement. The battle commenced around midday. Following Roman's order, the first line of the Byzantines moved forward gradually, like a moving wall, resolutely advancing into the battlefield. The heavy cavalry, the heavily armoured cataphracts, surged ahead, followed closely by infantry that maintained their formation. Opposing them, clusters of Seljuk horse archers swooped in, circling around the Byzantine flanks and showering them with arrows. Yet the Byzantine shields and the protective armour of the cataphracts proved highly effective, blocking the arrows and safeguarding their troops from harm. Methodically, the Byzantines pressed forward, their disciplined advance gradually forcing the Seljuk horse archers into retreat as planned, drawing the enemy away from their camp and luring them deeper into a trap. This strategic dance continued for several hours. Roman, observing the enemy's reluctance to engage in a direct fight and noting their retreat, grew increasingly impatient and fiery. His commands urged his forces onward, eager to corner and destroy the centre of the Seljuk forces, believing that their leader, the Sultan himself, was hidden somewhere near the core of the enemy ranks. By evening, the Byzantine army had advanced several kilometres away from their original camp and found themselves in unfamiliar, rugged terrain. They now stood far from home, on ground that was alien and unpredictable, a place where the outcome of the battle would be decided not just by numbers, but by strategy, discipline, and the resilience of each soldier. The entire formation of the Byzantine army began to falter as exhaustion took its toll on the soldiers. It was clear to Roman that achieving a decisive victory that day was no longer within reach. The sun was gradually setting, casting long shadows across the battlefield, and fighting in the encroaching darkness would be reckless and foolish. In that critical moment, he recognized the only right course of action. He issued orders for his troops to halt their advance, to turn around, and to withdraw in an organized and disciplined fashion back to their camp. Raising his standard high, a clear signal for retreat, he signaled to his army that it was time to withdraw. But then, disaster struck. The first act of catastrophe was rooted in the failure of the right flank, commanded by Fyodor Aliat. Whether due to misunderstanding or outright negligence, this wing failed to recognize the retreat signal or simply did not see it at all. Its units continued their pursuit of the Turks, breaking away from the main force and pressing forward despite the overall movement to retreat. The second tragic event was an act of treachery committed by the Pechenegs and Aghuzes, the Turco-Tatar mercenaries fighting for the Byzantines. Once they saw the familiar banners fluttering in the breeze and heard the native language spoken by those around them, these Turkic auxiliaries on the Byzantine flanks decided to switch sides. Recognizing the opportunity for allegiance with the enemy, they defected to the side of Alparslan. Their betrayal caused the flanks of the Byzantine army to collapse entirely, plunging the remaining formation into chaos and disarray. The third and most decisive act of treachery came from Andronikos Doukas. Observing the imperial standard being pulled back, rather than safeguarding the retreat of the central position, he gave the order for his reserve to depart, leaving the main body exposed and vulnerable. Rumours spread, fueled by false reports, that the emperor had been defeated and had already fled the battlefield. This rumour caused panic, and the freshest, most battle-hardened units of the army abandoned their posts and simply disappeared from the field, leaving the emperor stranded and without protection. For Alp Arslan, this sequence of events was the moment he had waited for all day. He issued an immediate order for a full-scale attack. The Seljuk crescent, the iconic symbol of their domain, began to tighten ominously around the now disorganized Byzantine forces. The Turks, who had spent the entire day feigning retreat, suddenly surged forward in a frenzy, with shouts of rage and determination, crashing into the ranks of Roman's disintegrating army and catching it completely off guard. In that terrible chaos, the centre of the Byzantine army found itself encircled, with no escape and no hope of support. What ensued was a brutal slaughter. The emperor's forces, deprived of their flanks and reserves, became an isolated island amid the raging storm of enemies. Roman the fair Diogenes, along with his guards, comprising Varangians, remnants of the Tagmat, and Armenian units, fought with desperate resolve, clawing and striking at their foes with everything they had. Roman, clad in gleaming gilded armour, fought as fiercely as any common soldier, swinging his sword with relentless courage, striking enemies on all sides. Yet the odds proved overwhelming. His horse was slain beneath him, and he himself was wounded in the arm amid the chaos. Bleeding and hurried, he continued to defend himself until he was finally surrounded and captured, unable to escape the encirclement. As darkness fell upon the battlefield, the combat finally ceased. Most of the Byzantine army had been either slaughtered or scattered, utterly shattered and defeated. The defeat was catastrophic and complete. For the first time in history, a Christian Roman emperor found himself in the hands of the enemy. That night marked an unprecedented moment of humiliation for Rome, a turning point that would echo through history. The captured emperor, filthy and bloodstained from the fierce fighting, was brought into the Sultan's tent. What happened next grew into legend, stories retold by both Christian and Muslim chroniclers, each embellishing the events in their own way. Alparslan, unable to believe that this battered, dusty man was indeed the mighty Basileus of Rum, the Roman emperor, looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Once his identity was confirmed, one version of the story states that the Sultan, showing a gesture of piety and gratitude to God, placed his foot on the defeated enemy's neck, a symbolic act of dominance and respect. However, other accounts recount that Alparslan stood the emperor up, embraced him with a gesture of regal magnanimity, and treated him with unexpected nobility. A famous dialogue reportedly took place between the two, which became legendary. The Sultan asked Roman what he would have done if he had been in his place at that moment, what actions he would have taken. With boldness, Roman replied that he would have ordered his soldiers to beat the Sultan with whips, indicating that he would have retaliated fiercely if roles had been reversed. Alparslan continued to question Roman about what he believed his course of action would be if their roles were reversed. Roman, with calm clarity, replied that Alparslan might either kill him outright, or drag him through his lands in chains, or, if Nadezhda's demand for an immense ransom proved to be unfounded, he would opt for the third choice. The Sultan, upon hearing this, revealed that he intended to choose that very option, that is, to negotiate peace. Alparslan was no barbarian, devoid of wisdom or sense of strategy. He was a shrewd diplomat and a wise statesman. He understood that killing the Byzantine emperor would serve no purpose. It would merely ignite the flames of revenge and retaliation. A living emperor, humiliated yet alive and indebted to him for his life and freedom. Such an outcome was much more valuable in his eyes. For an entire week, Alparslan kept Roman in his camp, treating him not as a mere prisoner, but as an honoured guest. They shared meals, engaged in long conversations, and gradually they forged a trust that led to the signing of a peace treaty. The conditions imposed were surprisingly lenient. Roman agreed to pay a hefty ransom of 500,000 gold coins immediately, followed by annual payments of 360,000 in exchange for a military alliance and the return of several border fortresses to the Seljuk Turks, including the strategically vital Manzikert. Most importantly, Alparslan did not insist on territorial concessions in Anatolia, nor did he plan to conquer more land there. His goal was solely to secure his southern flank and to accumulate funds for his primary campaign, an impending war against Egypt. Once the peace agreement was sealed, the Sultan presented Roman with generous gifts, provided him with an escort of distinguished retainers, and granted him freedom to return home. But when Roman reached his homeland, he found that no one was awaiting him. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, a sudden coup had taken place. The dukes, upon learning of their defeat, swiftly seized control of the city. Emperor John Duke proclaimed his nephew, Michael VI, as the new ruler. Meanwhile, Empress Eudokia was stripped and tonsured, turned into a monastic nun. As Roman, with a small retinue of loyal men, finally appeared in Anatolia after his release, he was branded a traitor and an illegitimate tyrant, an exile undeserving of mercy. A brief but bloody civil war erupted, plunging the empire into chaos. Roman attempted to resist, but his forces were too small and too disorganized to stand against the overwhelming tide. He was besieged within one of the Cilician fortresses, where his enemies promised him safety and the preservation of his eyesight if he surrendered. Trusting their word, Roman laid down his arms. However, the promise was false. In the year 772, Roman I Diogenes, the last warrior emperor of Byzantium, was cruelly blinded by order of his enemies. Hot irons were thrust into his eyes with such negligence that the wounds festered. Within days, he succumbed to agonizing pain in a monastery on the island of Prote. News of his friend's tragic fate infuriated and devastated Alparslan, but by then he could do nothing to alter it. Soon after, Alparslan himself met his end at the hands of his assassin. The death of Roman Diogenes proved to be a far greater catastrophe for Byzantium than the defeat at Manzikert itself. Although the battle had been lost, the treaty Alparslan had negotiated offered a glimmer of hope for eventual recovery and renewal. Unfortunately, the civil war that erupted in the aftermath shattered all prospects for restoring stability. The newly crowned emperor, Michael VI Duke, was a weak and inept ruler, more interested in theological debates than in managing the affairs of a war-torn empire. He refused to recognize the peace agreement secured by Rome, seeing it as a mere formal matter. For the Turkish tribes and the Ghazi, those fierce warriors Alparslan had maintained under firm control, the rejection served as a clear pretext for invasion. But what followed was no longer a regular military campaign launched by the Sultan's standing army. After Alparslan's death, his vast empire quickly began to unravel. The once tightly controlled Turkmen tribes and Ghazi, whom he had kept under his iron will, started to break free from his influence. They surged forward into the unprotected lands that had suddenly become vulnerable, as the strength of his centralized power dissolved. This chaos set the stage for a new, tumultuous chapter, one defined by the rapid and unpredictable expansion of Turkic forces into territories once held firmly by Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire's military was ultimately shattered at the Battle of Manzikert, an event that marked the beginning of a devastating chain reaction. In the aftermath of this defeat, the remaining Byzantine forces found themselves embroiled in internal strife, turning against each other in a brutal civil war. The rivals vying for the imperial throne, figures such as Nikephorenus and Nicephorianus, resorted to hiring Turkish mercenaries against one another, often employing these troops as allies in their power struggles and compensating them with land grants within the empire's territories. The gates of Anatolia were opened not solely through the sword of Alp Arslan, the great Seljuk Sultan, but more significantly through treachery, intrigue and discord among the Byzantines themselves. Over a span of just 10 or 15 years following the battle, a series of events unfolded that defied all belief. The very heart of the empire, Asia Minor, once the core of Byzantine civilization, its breadbasket, its recruitment ground for a millennium, was swiftly lost. Turkmen nomads, accompanied by their extensive herds, occupied the most fertile pastures across the central plateau. Meanwhile, the Greek and Armenian populations either fled to the safer coastal regions, fell into captivity, or gradually converted to Islam. These former nomads began establishing their own emirates, carving out independent states in the declining empire's lands. One such leader, a relative of the great sultans named Suleiman ibn Kutulmish, seized the city of Nicaea, located a mere 100 kilometers from Constantinople, and proclaimed the establishment of a new realm, the Rum Sultanate, a successor state rooted in the remnants of the Byzantine world. In this desperate hour, when Turkish forces already threatened the very gates of the imperial capital, the young and energetic emperor Alexios Maas and Komnenos reached out to the west in despair. In the year 1065, he sent envoys across the continent to Pope Urban II, beseeching him for military aid. His plea was for a handful of Western knights and mercenaries to help reclaim lost territories and defend the shattered empire. Yet, Pope Urban saw in this appeal a far greater opportunity. During the Council of Clermont, he delivered a fiery speech to the assembled European nobility and warriors, urging them not merely to aid the Byzantines, but to undertake a holy pilgrimage to the land of Christ, to liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem from non-believers. His call resonated through the halls of Europe, igniting an unprecedented response. This marked the dawn of the Crusades, a 2-century-long clash between Christian and Muslim worlds that would forever alter the course of history. While the Battle of Manzikert itself was not the direct cause of the Crusades, it served as the spark that ignited a massive and tumultuous chain of events. One military defeat, compounded by betrayal and internal conflict, resulted in the loss of Anatolia, the very cradle of Byzantine power. This catastrophe pushed the empire to the brink of extinction, prompting it to seek aid from the distant west. And this plea, deliberately or not, provided the pretext for the formidable and transformative movement we now call the Crusades. In the dusty Armenian plains, on an August day that would become one of history's turning points, the threads of fate intertwined in a bloody knot, so complex that even today, humanity has yet to fully untangle it. That fateful battle at Manzikert, a seemingly isolated clash, became the catalyst for a turbulent and revolutionary era. The defeat, the treachery, and the civil war that followed culminated in the catastrophic loss of Asia Minor for Byzantium. This loss pushed the empire to seek aid from distant lands, unintentionally opening the floodgates for a great religious and cultural upheaval. The ensuing centuries would witness relentless battles, ideological conflicts, and attempts at reconquest, all rooted in the profound upheavals of that period. Thank you for dedicating your time to explore one of the most consequential battles in human history. If this journey into the past sparked your interest, further stories and analyses of past events that shaped our world await your attention. Your engagement is the most valuable reward for this effort.